The night they put a price on my life was the same night I discovered that family can be born in the darkest places. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the abandoned shipping yard into a maze of shimmering puddles and rusted steel containers that stretched toward the gray horizon. Ethan Whitaker stood beneath the cracked awning of an old warehouse, his thin jacket already soaked through despite his efforts to stay dry. One trembling hand rested over the gentle curve of his stomach, a quiet instinct that had become second nature ever since he had learned he was carrying a child. Every cool breeze reminded him that he was no longer facing hardship alone. Somewhere beyond the warehouse doors, voices drifted through the damp night air. Some were calm, others impatient, but every word sounded like another reminder that his future had slipped beyond his control. Just 6 months earlier, Ethan's biggest concern had been whether the neighborhood library would receive enough donations to keep its children's reading program alive. He had spent peaceful afternoons helping little kids discover stories about brave explorers and magical forests. The shelves had smelled of paper and old wood, and the laughter of children had made every difficult day worthwhile. Then everything collapsed. His parents had passed away years before, leaving the family house to his Uncle Warren, who promised to protect them both. Ethan had believed him. Instead, Warren quietly borrowed money from dangerous lenders to support a failing business that never recovered. When every payment came due at once, Warren made a decision that Ethan would never have imagined possible. He signed papers using Ethan's name without permission and arranged for someone else to settle the debt. Ethan wasn't told until the very last moment. "You won't be hurt," Warren had insisted while refusing to meet his nephew's eyes. "You'll have food, a roof, medical care. This is the only way any of us survive." Ethan remembered staring at the document in disbelief. There was no place for his opinion, no line asking whether he agreed. Only signatures and numbers that treated a human life like another financial obligation. The realization settled over him with an icy weight. He had not been rescued from debt. He had become the payment. A pair of expensive black SUVs rolled silently into the shipping yard, their headlights cutting through the rain like pale ribbons. Several men stepped out wearing dark coats, speaking into earpieces with quiet professionalism rather than intimidation. They surveyed every corner before one of them opened the rear passenger door. A tall man emerged without any unnecessary movement. Victor Callahan carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. His charcoal overcoat shielded him from the weather, but the rain still collected along his shoulders as though even nature hesitated to disturb him. His expression remained unreadable while his sharp gray eyes settled briefly on Ethan. There was no anger in them, no cruelty either, only careful observation. Ethan lowered his gaze, uncertain whether he should speak first. The silence stretched long enough for the rain to become the loudest sound in the yard. One of Victor's associates handed over a sealed folder. Victor opened it, scanned several pages, then looked back toward Ethan with faint confusion replacing his earlier indifference. "You're expecting a child," Victor finally said, his voice steady and controlled. Ethan instinctively wrapped both arms around himself before giving the smallest nod. "Yes." Victor closed the folder. That information wasn't included. Another quiet silence followed. The men standing nearby exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for instructions that did not immediately come. Ethan prepared himself for disappointment, believing this unexpected detail would only make his situation worse. Instead, Victor studied him for another long moment before asking a question that surprised everyone present. "Did you choose to be here?" Ethan's lips parted, but no answer came. The truth felt too enormous to fit into words. His silence became an answer of its own. Victor looked toward the man who had delivered the paperwork. "Find out who approved this arrangement," he said evenly. "Every document, every signature." The associate nodded and stepped away to make a phone call. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Nothing about this meeting resembled the terrifying scenarios he had imagined during the drive to the harbor. Nobody shouted. Nobody threatened him. Yet uncertainty remained just as frightening. Victor slipped the folder beneath one arm and took one slow step closer, careful not to invade Ethan's space. "You're coming with me," he said. Ethan swallowed hard. "Do I have a choice?" Victor held his gaze for the first time. "Tonight, your only responsibility is staying safe." Those words should not have carried any comfort. They came from a man whose name appeared in whispered conversations across the city, a man connected to an empire built on power and impossible influence. And yet, standing alone beneath the endless rain with nowhere else to go, Ethan realized they were the kindest words anyone had spoken to him in weeks. As he climbed into the waiting vehicle, he looked back one final time at the warehouse where his old life had quietly ended. He had no idea that the road ahead would lead not only into the heart of a mafia household, but toward 3 lonely children who were waiting for someone they had never realized they needed. Ethan barely remembered the drive through the city. The steady rhythm of rain against the windows and the soft hum of the engine blended into a haze that matched the exhaustion settling deep inside him. Every few minutes he glanced at the passing streets, wondering if he would ever see freedom again or whether every turn simply carried him farther away from the ordinary life he had lost. Nearly 40 minutes later, the vehicle slowed before a pair of towering wrought iron gates that opened without hesitation. Beyond them stood an estate unlike anything Ethan had ever imagined. The mansion was built from pale stone, surrounded by towering oak trees and perfectly trimmed gardens that stretched across several acres. Warm lights glowed behind enormous windows, giving the home an unexpected feeling of comfort despite its imposing size. It looked less like the headquarters of a feared organization and more like a place where generations of one family had quietly lived together. As the vehicle stopped beneath the covered entrance, 2 house staff members stepped outside with umbrellas. They greeted Victor respectfully before turning their attention toward Ethan with polite curiosity rather than judgment. That simple kindness caught Ethan off guard. Nobody asked questions. Nobody stared at the gentle curve beneath his jacket. One of the staff members smiled softly and said, "Welcome inside. Dinner is still warm if you are hungry." Ethan had almost forgotten what genuine hospitality sounded like. Inside, polished hardwood floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Family portraits decorated the walls instead of expensive displays meant to impress visitors. A grandfather clock ticked steadily near the grand staircase, filling the quiet with a peaceful rhythm. The mansion felt alive, yet strangely lonely, as though laughter had once filled every room before slowly disappearing. Victor removed his coat and handed it to another employee before speaking calmly. "Prepare the East guest suite. Arrange a medical examination tomorrow morning. Make sure everything the baby may need is available." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You do not even know me." Victor looked toward him briefly. "I know enough to understand that someone expecting a child should not have to worry about basic necessities." Before Ethan could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere upstairs, followed immediately by 3 small voices talking over one another. Tiny footsteps raced across the second floor with astonishing speed. A woman in her 60s sighed with affectionate resignation as she hurried toward the staircase. "Young Masters," she called, trying not to laugh. Running inside the hallway is still running. 3 children suddenly appeared at the top landing. They could not have been older than 5 years old. One had neatly combed brown hair. Another wore mismatched socks with complete confidence. The third carried a stuffed dinosaur tucked beneath one arm. Their bright blue eyes landed on Ethan all at once. The hallway became perfectly silent. "Who is that?" The boy with the dinosaur whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The housekeeper smiled. "That is a guest." The tallest of the 3 folded his arms with remarkable seriousness. "Guests do not stay long." The second child tilted his head. "Maybe he is another teacher." The smallest frowned. "Teachers always leave too." Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. Those words carried far more sadness than any child their age should have known. Victor remained completely still. His expression softened almost too quickly to notice before returning to its usual calm. "Bedtime," he told them gently. None of the children argued, but all 3 continued watching Ethan while the housekeeper guided them upstairs. Just before disappearing around the corner, the smallest child gave Ethan one tiny wave. Ethan raised his hand in return without thinking. Victor noticed the exchange. "Their names are Avery, Mason, and Riley," he said quietly after the children were gone. "They lost their mother 2 years ago." Ethan lowered his eyes. Suddenly the silence filling the enormous mansion made perfect sense. This was not simply a wealthy home. It was a place where grief had quietly settled into every room. A member of the household soon escorted Ethan to a spacious guest suite overlooking the gardens. Fresh clothes rested neatly on the bed. Baby care books, prenatal vitamins, and a pitcher of water had already been placed on the nightstand. Everything had been prepared within minutes of his arrival. Standing alone beside the window, Ethan watched the rain finally begin to fade beneath the moonlight. For the first time since his life had fallen apart, he slept beneath a safe roof. Yet deep inside, he could not shake the feeling that the greatest challenge waiting for him was not the powerful Alpha who had brought him here. It was earning the trust of three lonely little hearts that had already learned to expect every grown-up to disappear. Ethan woke to the aroma of fresh bread and brewed coffee drifting through the guest suite. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. The soft mattress beneath him, the quiet stillness beyond the window, and the absence of fear felt unfamiliar after weeks of constant anxiety. Then reality slowly returned. He rested a gentle hand over his stomach, whispered a silent promise to the tiny life growing inside him, and stepped into a new day that felt uncertain yet strangely peaceful. A member of the household greeted him outside the room with a warm smile and guided him toward the breakfast room. The long oak table had already been set, but only one place contained food. Victor was nowhere in sight. Mr. Callahan left early for work, the housekeeper explained. He asked us to make sure you eat before your appointment with the doctor this afternoon. Ethan thanked her quietly and sat down. Before he could take his first bite, three small heads peeked around the doorway. Avery, Mason, and Riley stood shoulder to shoulder like curious little detectives studying a complete stranger. None of them entered the room. They simply watched him in complete silence. Ethan smiled politely. "Good morning." No one answered. Instead, Mason whispered something into Avery's ear, and all three disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. A few minutes later, Ethan finished breakfast and wandered into the library that overlooked the gardens. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with classic novels, history books, and children's stories. His heart immediately softened. Books had always made him feel safe. He reached toward a familiar picture book resting on the lowest shelf, only to discover it was missing. Moments later, he heard tiny footsteps followed by muffled giggles. Ethan turned around just in time to see Riley dart behind a large armchair, holding the missing book against his chest. Mason had quietly moved Ethan's glass of water onto the highest bookshelf where it was impossible to reach without assistance. Avery stood near the doorway, trying very hard not to smile. Ethan immediately understood what was happening. They were testing him. Instead of becoming frustrated, he pretended not to notice. He searched dramatically around the room. "That is strange," he said with exaggerated confusion. "I was certain this book knew how to stay on the shelf all by itself." Tiny laughter escaped from behind the chair. Ethan continued the game. "Perhaps books grow little feet at night." Riley burst into laughter before covering his mouth. The sound echoed through the library like music that had not visited the house in a very long time. Ethan slowly walked toward the chair and crouched down. "There you are," he whispered with a smile. Riley hugged the book tighter. It wanted to hide. "Then maybe we should read it together so it does not feel lonely anymore." Riley looked uncertain but did not run away. Avery folded his arms. "Adults always stop playing after one day." Ethan blinked. "Do they?" Mason nodded seriously. "They promise things. Then they leave." The words settled heavily inside Ethan's heart. He realized these children were not trying to be difficult. They were trying to protect themselves from disappointment. Before Ethan could answer, a sudden wave of dizziness swept through him. His vision blurred for only a second, but it was enough. He instinctively reached for the edge of the bookshelf while taking a slow breath. Riley's eyes widened first. "He is sick." Avery immediately abandoned his guarded expression. "Get Miss Eleanor." Mason raced out of the room faster than Ethan thought possible. Within seconds, the housekeeper hurried inside, while another employee called the family physician. "I am all right," Ethan insisted gently. "I only stood up too quickly." Even so, Miss Eleanor guided him to a nearby sofa and handed him a glass of juice. The doctor arrived less than 30 minutes later and completed a thorough examination. After listening carefully to the baby's heartbeat and checking Ethan's condition, he smiled reassuringly. "Everything looks healthy. You simply need more rest, regular meals, and less stress." Ethan released a quiet sigh of relief. As the doctor packed his bag, he noticed three little faces peeking through the half-open doorway again. Riley finally gathered enough courage to step inside, carrying the picture book with both hands. He carefully placed it beside Ethan before whispering, "The book wanted you to have it back." Ethan smiled with genuine warmth. "Thank you." Riley hesitated for another second before asking the question that surprised everyone in the room. "Are you coming back after your nap?" Ethan met the child's hopeful eyes and answered without hesitation, "Yes, I will still be here." None of the children smiled right away, but something quietly changed in the room. For the very first time since Ethan had entered the mansion, the triplets no longer looked at him as another visitor passing through their lives. They looked at him as someone who might actually stay. Ethan spent the next several days settling into a rhythm that felt almost unreal. Every morning began with breakfast in the bright dining room, followed by quiet walks through the gardens whenever the weather allowed. The triplets still tested him in small ways, hiding his reading glasses, swapping the labels on tea tins, or racing away whenever he tried to gather them for lunch, but each prank ended with laughter instead of frustration. Little by little, the enormous mansion sounded less like an empty museum and more like a home waking from a long sleep. Victor, however, remained a distant figure. He usually left before sunrise and returned long after the children were asleep. On the rare evenings their schedules crossed, he would ask Ethan a few thoughtful questions about his health, listen carefully to the doctor's recommendations, and quietly make certain every request had already been fulfilled before anyone else could act. It puzzled Ethan. Victor never behaved as though Ethan owed him gratitude, nor did he treat him like a guest who would soon leave. Instead, he acted as though Ethan's safety had become another responsibility that simply belonged on his shoulders. Late one afternoon, while Ethan and the children colored pictures on the sunroom floor, Victor's longtime advisor, Samuel Mercer, arrived carrying a thick leather folder. His usually calm expression appeared unusually serious. Victor led him into the study and closed the door, but through the slightly open window, Ethan unintentionally caught fragments of their conversation while helping Riley gather scattered crayons from the patio. "The documents were forged," Samuel said quietly. "Every signature placing Ethan into that agreement was falsified. Warren Whitaker received money, but Ethan never consented." A long silence followed before Samuel continued. "There is something else. The debt itself was purchased by Dominic Vale only 2 weeks before the transfer." Victor's voice remained controlled, yet noticeably colder. "Dominic never invests in random financial disputes." "Exactly," Samuel replied. "We believe Ethan was selected long before the paperwork reached your desk." Ethan froze where he stood. Dominic Vale. The name meant nothing to him, yet hearing that his own life had been planned like a business transaction sent a chill through his entire body. Before he could think further, Avery tugged gently on his sleeve. "Can you help me finish my drawing?" Ethan forced a reassuring smile and nodded, pushing the unsettling conversation aside for the children's sake. That evening, Victor unexpectedly joined everyone for dinner. The atmosphere felt lighter than usual as Mason proudly explained how Riley had finally beaten him at a board game, while Avery carefully described the birdhouse they hoped to build over the weekend. Victor listened with quiet attention, occasionally smiling in ways so subtle that Ethan almost missed them. After the children had gone upstairs with Miss Eleanor, Victor remained seated across from Ethan in the softly lit dining room. "You heard part of our conversation today," he said without accusation. Ethan hesitated before answering honestly. "I did not mean to listen." Victor nodded once. "I know." He rested both hands on the table. "None of what happened to you was your fault. Someone used your family's hardship to manipulate events for reasons we do not fully understand yet." Ethan looked down at his folded hands. "I spent days believing my uncle simply made a terrible choice." "He did," Victor replied calmly. "But someone else made certain he believed he had no other option." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Learning that he had been deceived did not erase the betrayal, but it changed the shape of it. Victor stood and walked toward the window overlooking the moonlit gardens. "Until I know the truth," he said quietly, "this house remains the safest place for you and your child." Ethan followed his gaze toward the lights glowing softly from the second floor where the triplets were already asleep. For the first time since arriving, he realized Victor was no longer protecting only a guest. He was protecting someone whose story had unexpectedly become intertwined with his own family's future. Ethan discovered that routines had a quiet way of healing wounds no one could see. By the second week, the mansion no longer felt unfamiliar. Every morning the triplets waited outside the guest suite before breakfast, pretending they had simply happened to be passing through the hallway, even though Miss Eleanor later admitted they had been checking the clock to see when Ethan usually woke up. Instead of correcting them, Ethan smiled and invited them to help prepare blueberry pancakes. The kitchen staff gladly stepped aside as tiny hands carefully measured flour, stirred batter, and proudly argued over whose turn it was to crack the eggs. Riley accidentally scattered flour across the counter. Mason laughed so hard he nearly dropped the mixing bowl, and Avery quietly slipped a clean towel into Ethan's hand before anyone else noticed the mess. By the time breakfast reached the dining room, everyone was wearing more flour than the pancakes. Even the cooks could not hide their smiles. Victor returned unexpectedly that afternoon after a meeting was canceled. As he entered the house, he paused outside the dining room. Through the partially open doors, he watched Ethan sitting between the children while they colored paper placemats after lunch. Riley leaned comfortably against Ethan's shoulder as he concentrated on drawing a dinosaur wearing a firefighter's helmet. Mason insisted every dinosaur needed a cape because heroes always wore capes. Avery carefully wrote everyone's names beneath each picture so they would not become mixed up. The room echoed with cheerful conversations that had once been absent from the house. Miss Eleanor quietly joined Victor in the hallway. "It has been a long time since they laughed this much," she whispered. Victor continued watching without speaking. They used to wait every evening hoping their mother would come home from the hospital. Miss Eleanor continued gently. "After we lost her, the house became very quiet. They stopped asking people to stay because saying goodbye hurt too much." Victor lowered his eyes for a moment before walking away without disturbing them. That evening, Ethan noticed a large stack of unopened children's books delivered to the library. Each carried a small note written in Victor's careful handwriting. "For family reading nights." Ethan smiled to himself. He suspected the books had not been purchased for the children alone. After dinner, Ethan gathered the triplets inside the library. Together, they built a blanket fort using chairs, pillows, and every spare blanket they could find. Flashlights rested beside them as Ethan read stories about brave explorers crossing mountains, clever foxes solving mysteries, and ordinary children discovering extraordinary courage. Riley eventually fell asleep against Ethan's side before the final chapter ended. Mason yawned so often that he could barely keep his eyes open, while Avery quietly listened until the very last page before asking, "Will you read another one tomorrow?" Ethan gently brushed a strand of hair away from the little boy's forehead. "If you would like me to." Avery nodded without hesitation. "Please." Later that night, Victor walked upstairs intending to check on his children before returning to work in his office. He stopped outside the library when he noticed the lights were still glowing softly beneath the doorway. Looking inside, he found Ethan asleep in an armchair with Riley curled safely against his chest. Mason had stretched across the rug wrapped inside one of the blankets, while Avery had somehow fallen asleep with an open book resting on his lap. The unfinished blanket fort leaned slightly to one side, surrounded by crayons, storybooks, and half-finished drawings. It was untidy, peaceful, and unmistakably alive. Victor quietly entered the room. Instead of waking anyone, he carefully lifted Mason into his arms and carried him toward his bedroom. After returning, he gently picked up Avery, who instinctively rested his head against his father's shoulder without waking. When Victor came back for Riley, the little boy tightened his sleepy grip on Ethan's sweater and murmured softly, "Do not go." Ethan opened his eyes just enough to smile. "I am right here." Victor stood silently for a long moment, watching the simple exchange. In all the years since losing his wife, nothing had eased the loneliness inside those three little hearts the way Ethan had done, without even trying. For the first time, Victor allowed himself to wonder whether the greatest gift that had entered his home was never part of anyone's plan at all. The peaceful rhythm that had settled over the Callahan estate lasted only a few more days before small changes began to disturb the quiet. It started with unfamiliar vehicles lingering outside the front gates longer than usual before driving away. Security personnel spoke more frequently into their earpieces, and Samuel Mercer appeared at the mansion twice in a single afternoon, carrying sealed folders instead of his usual tablet. Ethan noticed the difference even though no one offered an explanation. He chose not to ask. Instead, he focused on helping the triplets build a birdhouse in the garden, encouraging Avery to measure each wooden panel, while Mason insisted every bird deserved colorful decorations. Riley carefully painted tiny blue stars along the roof because he believed birds liked beautiful homes just as much as people did. Their laughter echoed through the backyard until one of the security officers quietly approached Victor with an urgent expression. Victor listened without interrupting, then looked toward Ethan across the lawn. For only a brief second, concern crossed his face before he calmly instructed the children to finish their project inside the greenhouse. Ethan sensed something had changed. That evening, after the triplets had fallen asleep, Victor invited Ethan into the study. A folder rested on the polished desk beside several photographs. Victor remained standing near the window, watching the lights beyond the estate. "Someone has been asking questions about you," he said quietly. Ethan frowned in confusion. "About me?" Victor nodded. "Your name has appeared in conversations that have nothing to do with your family or your former life." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "I do not understand. I have never been important enough for anyone to notice." Samuel gently slid one photograph across the desk. It showed Ethan leaving the neighborhood library months earlier. Another captured him entering a grocery store. A third had been taken outside the small apartment where he had once lived. Ethan stared at the images in disbelief. Someone had been watching him long before the night at the warehouse. "Dominic Vale's people collected these," Samuel explained. "We believe he wanted information about anyone connected to financial accounts he intended to acquire. Somehow, your uncle's debt became part of that plan." Ethan lowered himself into a chair, trying to process what he had heard. His ordinary life suddenly seemed far less ordinary. Victor spoke again, his voice calm enough to steady the room. "We still do not know why Dominic considered your situation valuable, but I will not allow anyone to use you or your child again." Before Ethan could answer, a soft knock interrupted them. Miss Eleanor stepped inside with Riley wrapped in a blanket, still half asleep. "He had a bad dream," she whispered apologetically. Riley rubbed his eyes before spotting Ethan. Without hesitation, he reached out both arms. "Can you stay with me until I fall asleep again?" Ethan smiled gently and accepted the sleepy little boy into his embrace. Victor watched the moment unfold in silence. Riley rested comfortably against Ethan's shoulder as though it had become the safest place in the world. The sight softened something inside Victor that years of responsibility and loss had carefully hidden. As Ethan carried Riley upstairs, Avery and Mason quietly opened their bedroom door, both clearly awakened by the commotion. "Is everything all right?" Avery asked. Ethan nodded reassuringly. "Everything is fine. Your brother just needed someone nearby." Mason looked relieved. "Can you read one chapter before we go back to sleep?" Ethan laughed softly. "Only one chapter." Minutes later, all three children sat together beneath a warm blanket while Ethan read from the adventure novel they had started the night before. Outside, security lights swept slowly across the grounds, reminding everyone that uncertainty still waited beyond the estate. Inside, however, three children listened peacefully to a familiar voice, and for the first time in many years, the Callahan mansion felt less like a fortress protecting its residents from danger and more like a home protecting the family they were slowly becoming. Early the next morning, the estate awakened beneath a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain. Ethan found the triplets already waiting in the garden with tiny watering cans, determined to care for the flowers Miss Eleanor had helped them plant the week before. Riley proudly announced that every flower needed a name. Mason insisted they should organize races for ladybugs instead, and Avery carefully read the instructions printed on the seed packets as though he had been appointed official gardener. Watching them laugh together filled Ethan with a quiet happiness he had not expected to find again. For the first time in many months, he no longer measured each day by fear, but by simple moments worth remembering. As the morning continued, Samuel arrived carrying another folder. He exchanged only a brief glance with Victor before the two men stepped onto a distant terrace overlooking the grounds. Their conversation remained private, yet Ethan noticed Victor's posture grow noticeably more serious. A few minutes later, Victor returned alone and asked Ethan if they could walk together through the orchard while the children remained with Miss Eleanor. Ethan agreed without hesitation. The orchard stretched across several acres, its rows of apple trees casting long patches of shade over the narrow gravel paths. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Victor broke the silence. Samuel confirmed that Dominic's people have stopped asking about your former address. Ethan looked relieved until Victor continued. Instead, they are asking questions about this estate. Ethan's expression immediately changed. Because I am here? Victor nodded once. That is the most likely explanation. Ethan lowered his eyes. Then perhaps I should leave before I become a burden to your family. Victor stopped walking. His answer came without hesitation. You are not a burden. Ethan looked up in surprise. Victor's voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. You did not choose the circumstances that brought you here. Leaving now would not solve anything. It would only place you and your child in greater uncertainty. Ethan searched Victor's face for even the smallest sign of obligation, but found none. Before he could respond, hurried footsteps echoed across the gravel path. Avery came running toward them with Mason and Riley close behind. All three children were breathing hard from excitement. We have been looking everywhere, Mason said. Riley reached Ethan first and wrapped both little arms around his hand. Miss Eleanor said lunch is ready. Avery hesitated before speaking again. We wanted you both to come together. Ethan smiled softly. Then we should not keep everyone waiting. The five of them returned toward the house at an easy pace. Halfway across the lawn, Riley suddenly slipped on damp grass. Before Ethan could react, Victor reached down and lifted the little boy effortlessly into his arms. Riley laughed instead of crying and rested comfortably against his father's shoulder. Mason grinned. Now Ethan does not have to worry. Avery nodded thoughtfully. Dad carries Riley. Ethan carries the baby. Everybody is carrying somebody. The innocent observation stopped both adults in their tracks. Victor and Ethan exchanged a brief glance before smiling almost at the same moment. Neither child realized how deeply those simple words reached. During lunch, the atmosphere remained unusually cheerful. The triplets proudly presented the birdhouse they had finished painting, complete with bright blue stars across the roof. Ethan praised every crooked brushstroke, while Victor quietly promised they would place it near the largest oak tree that afternoon. After the meal, Riley climbed onto his chair and looked from Victor to Ethan with complete seriousness. Can I ask something? Victor nodded. Of course. Riley took a deep breath. If Ethan stays here forever, can we stop calling him a guest? The dining room became perfectly still. Mason slowly nodded in agreement. Avery looked down at his folded hands before whispering, Guests always leave. We do not want him to be a guest anymore. Ethan felt tears gathering before he could stop them. He had spent so much of his life wondering where he truly belonged that hearing those words from three little children felt almost unbelievable. Victor looked at each of his children in turn before meeting Ethan's eyes across the table. Although neither of them spoke, they both understood that something important had quietly changed. The house that had once offered Ethan temporary shelter had become the first place where someone had asked him to stay, not because they needed his help, but because they had already begun to think of him as family. Ethan found himself wandering through the quieter wings of the mansion a few days later while the triplets attended their music lesson. Miss Eleanor mentioned that Victor's late wife had loved restoring forgotten corners of the old estate, and curiosity eventually led Ethan to a small sunlit sitting room that had remained untouched for years. Dust danced through the afternoon light as he gently opened a carved wooden cabinet. Inside rested neatly arranged photo albums, children's handprints preserved in clay, and a delicate music box decorated with tiny painted flowers. Ethan hesitated before lifting the lid. A gentle melody drifted through the room, soft enough to feel like a memory carried by the wind. Tucked beneath the music box was a folded envelope with no seal. Ethan recognized immediately that it was something personal and almost returned it without opening it. Before he could close the cabinet, Victor's voice came quietly from the doorway. You can read it if you wish. Ethan turned, surprised to find Victor standing there. His expression held no anger, only a calm sadness that seemed older than either of them. Ethan carefully unfolded the letter. It was written in graceful handwriting by Victor's wife only a few months before her passing. Most of it spoke about the children, describing Avery's thoughtful nature, Mason's endless curiosity, and Riley's gentle heart. Near the end, one sentence made Ethan stop reading for a moment. If our children ever need someone to help them smile again, I hope you never let guilt stop you from opening your heart. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. Victor walked to the window overlooking the gardens where the triplets often played. For a long time, I believed loving anyone again would mean I had forgotten her, he admitted quietly. So I buried myself in work and convinced myself the children only needed stability. Ethan stepped beside him. They needed you. Victor nodded. And I was there. But I was not truly present. His eyes remained fixed on the gardens below. Then you arrived, and this house remembered how to laugh. Ethan looked down at the letter resting gently in his hands. She loved them very much. She still shapes this family, Victor answered. Not through grief, but through everything she taught us before she left. At that moment, the sound of excited footsteps echoed down the hallway. The triplets burst into the room carrying a large sheet of folded paper. We made something, Mason announced proudly. Avery carefully unfolded the paper across the table. It was a drawing of the entire household standing beneath the enormous oak tree in the backyard. Victor stood on one side, Ethan on the other, and the three children held hands between them. Even the tiny baby inside Ethan's stomach had been included as a smiling little figure surrounded by bright yellow stars. Riley pointed proudly at the picture. There is one more person too. Ethan noticed a small figure drawn near the top of the page beside the branches of the oak tree. Who was that? Riley smiled. Mom. Miss Eleanor said people we love never stop being part of the family. Silence settled over the room. Victor's eyes glistened as he looked at the drawing. Instead of sadness, Ethan saw gratitude. He knelt beside the children and smiled. I think she would love this picture. Avery carefully handed the drawing to Victor. Can we hang it in the hallway? Victor looked at each of his children before answering. Yes, right in the center where everyone can see it. That evening, the drawing was placed beside the family photographs near the grand staircase. No one removed the older portraits. Instead, the new picture became another chapter beside them, quietly acknowledging that love did not disappear when life changed. It simply made room for new memories without asking anyone to forget the old ones. As Ethan climbed the stairs that night with the triplets laughing around him, he realized he was no longer walking through someone else's home. He was helping a family honor its past while slowly building a future together, one gentle day at a time. Autumn arrived quietly, covering the Callahan estate in shades of amber and gold. The towering oak tree in the backyard had become the center of family traditions, its branches now holding the birdhouse the triplets had painted together months before. Tiny birds came every morning, and Riley insisted they were visiting because they knew this was a happy home. Ethan smiled every time he heard that explanation. In many ways, he believed the little boy was right. The house no longer echoed with silence. Laughter drifted through the hallways, storybooks remained open on library tables, and the kitchen was filled almost every afternoon with the sound of small voices asking impossible questions. One crisp Saturday morning, Samuel arrived carrying a single envelope. He handed it to Victor before quietly excusing himself. Victor opened the letter, read it once, and then walked into the garden where Ethan sat watching the triplets collect colorful leaves. He offered the envelope without saying a word. Ethan unfolded the document slowly. It confirmed that every fraudulent debt connected to his uncle had been permanently canceled after a complete investigation. His legal identity, financial records, and future belonged entirely to him again. There were no remaining obligations. No contracts. No conditions. Ethan looked up in surprise. I am free. Victor nodded gently. You always deserve to be. A long silence followed as a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the lawn. Finally, Victor spoke again. You may stay here as long as you wish, or you may choose a different life somewhere else. This decision belongs only to you. Ethan stared at the paper in his hands. For so long, every important choice had been made by someone else. Now, for the first time in many months, the future stood completely open before him. Before he could answer, three familiar voices interrupted the quiet. Avery came running first, followed closely by Mason and Riley. What happened? Mason asked. Ethan smiled through tears that refused to stay hidden. Everything is all right. Riley looked worried anyway. Then why are you crying? Ethan knelt, so he could meet all 3 children at eye level. Sometimes happy moments make people cry too. Avery studied the paper before looking toward Victor. Does this mean Ethan has to leave now? Victor answered honestly, only if he wants to. The 3 children immediately turned back toward Ethan with anxious expressions. Riley reached for Ethan's hand first. Please stay. Mason nodded so quickly that his hair bounced. We still have books to read and birdhouses to build. Avery swallowed before quietly adding, and we already think of you as family. Ethan could not hold back his emotions any longer. He wrapped all 3 children into one gentle embrace before looking toward Victor. When I arrived here, I believed I had lost everything, he said softly. Instead, I found the family I never thought I would have. Victor stepped closer. Is that your answer? Ethan smiled with complete certainty. Yes, I am home. Several months later, winter sunlight poured through the nursery windows as a healthy baby slept peacefully in a small wooden crib. The triplets argued cheerfully over whose turn it was to read the next picture book, while Victor quietly assembled a rocking chair nearby. Family photographs now lined the hallway, each one marking another ordinary day made extraordinary simply because they were together. One picture showed flower-covered pancakes. Another captured the finished birdhouse beneath the great oak tree. The newest portrait displayed Victor, Ethan, the triplets, and the baby smiling beneath a clear blue sky, with the children's first family drawing framed beside it as a reminder of where their journey had truly begun. Ethan often thought back to the frightened person who had stood alone in the rain, believing his life had already been decided by strangers. He finally understood that a person's worth could never be measured by debt, fear, or the mistakes of others. Real family was built through kindness freely given, trust patiently earned, and the quiet choice to remain beside one another every single day. Looking around the warm home filled with laughter, Ethan realized that the greatest gift he had ever received was not rescue. It was being loved enough to choose and choosing to stay. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.